All right, everyone, get ready because today we've got someone who's been battling pests longer than some of us has been licensed. Our speaker started in the pest management industry back in 1994, worked in the field right here in Texas, and went on to earn both his master's and Ph.D. in entomology from Texas A&M University. So yes, he really knows bugs. He's a board certified entomologist, a former researcher studying termiticides and even the dark rover ant. And today he serves as technical service manager for Syngenta across the Southwest. When he's not talking insects, he's outdoors hunting, fishing, or camping. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Keefer.
Thanks, Jason. I'm going to share my screen real quick, see if I can get this right. And always an issue.
The thing at the bottom, the little it looks
Yeah,
like a little, yeah, there you go. That's it.
that one. That one goes, and then I need to do this, this. Okay, are we finally okay?
Yes, there it
All
is.
right, good. Sorry, it always
No,
takes
you're
long.
you're okay. It takes a minute to do it.
Yeah, so thanks to the TPCA and thank you, Jason. And with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. So today we'll be talking about urban cockroach management. And just a quick overview of kind of what we're going to do. We'll briefly look at the kind of the history or the fossil record of cockroaches and kind of some economics and a little bit of market overview, which is some data from PCT magazine, PMP magazine. Well, you got to talk biology just for a second and look at the life cycle of cockroaches. And then, German cockroaches are really a public health pest in some instances. So we'll talk about that. Look at some of the key species that we deal with on a regular basis. Then we're going to kind of focus on American cockroaches and German cockroaches. We'll talk a little bit of treatment and then being good stewards of the industry. So when looking at the history of cockroaches, they're one of the oldest surviving land-dwelling arthropod groups on the planet. And we know that by looking at the fossil record going all the way back to, the Devonian period and Carboniferous period, Permian period, Triassic, and you can kind of see that timeline down there on the bottom. And so we also know that from looking at cave art or cave drawings from, back in Europe and other parts of the world in the Middle East, where there's drawings of, roachoids or insects or animals that look like roaches. So, we know they've been around a long time. And then when you actually date those fossil records of cockroaches predate humans by 300 million years. And so they've been here a long time is the point, and they're going to be here a long time. So cockroaches, there's about 4,500 species globally. When you look at taxonomy, there's over 500 genera, thousands of species potentially undescribed to date. So we always talk about looking at the rainforest in Brazil, and there's all kinds of insects and other animals walking through there that we potentially have not described. And so this little chart here is a lot of fun. When I do talks in person with smaller groups, I like to get people up on stage and try to pronounce some of these names in the different languages. It's a lot of fun, and I can't say them either, so it's a good time though. So, how did the cockroaches get to the New World, meaning the Western Hemisphere? And so it's widely debated, but if you get into the scientific literature, it's really thought that they, followed the trade routes from the Eastern Hemisphere to the Western Hemisphere. And back in the day, that would have been on boats, before air travel. So when you look at the American cockroach, Australian cockroach, smoky brown, they reached the United States from West Africa on ships. If you look at German cockroaches, Oriental cockroaches, it's thought that they reached the United States by boat from North Africa, Russia, or even Western Europe. So there's lots of literature out there if you kind of want to look at the history of cockroaches and how they moved about the United States. So as humans, we do a bunch of weird things with cockroaches. And so there's Madagascar hissing cockroaches. So when Jason was talking about my previous life, where I was at Texas A&M as a graduate student and researcher, there we would go out and do go speak at elementary schools. And so I would always take hissing cockroaches. And if you want to get a room of about 400 third graders really quiet, take a hissing cockroach in there and tell them that if you get really quiet and I'm going to rub the back of this cockroach and it's going to hiss into the microphone. And so I had complete silence. The teachers were saying they've never been this quiet ever. And so as soon as I, stroked the back of that cockroach and it hissed into that microphone, it was chaos. Kids were running and jumping, and it was things like that are a lot of fun. And those are things I kind of remember from those days. But we also use cockroaches to feed our pets. We think about snakes, reptiles, amphibians, or those bearded dragons and some of these animals that people keep at home. They feed them cockroaches in lots of cases. And then there's also people that collect cockroaches. I didn't really believe this, but I went online and found a blog, and sure enough, there were people trading cockroaches, from Florida to Washington, and then Maine to Arizona. And they're sending these exotic cockroaches. Sometimes they're alive, and sometimes they're dead. But just a weird thing that I never really thought happened. And then those of us that have been in academia in the research world, cockroaches can cause allergens. And so when you open up the what we would call the insectary room where we keep all of our live insects, you could definitely smell, the cockroaches and the other insects that are in there. And then they're used for medicinal purposes and spas to kind of revitalize the skin, is at least what they say. So, looking at those 4,500 species, less than 100 like to live around humans or are synanthropic. And then when you break that down even more, less than 1% are actually considered pests. And so a lot of these cockroaches have beneficial uses across the planet. Cockroaches are very omnivorous. They feed on everything that you and I would feed on and a whole lot of other things that you and I would not feed on. And so that's how it's thought that the relationship with humans and cockroaches began, because we had food that we were cooking, and the cockroaches would sense that and come in, and they wanted to feed on the same things we like. Also, cockroaches like the same types of environments that we like. So they like, when in the summer when it's super hot, they like it a little bit cooler and a lot of humidity. When it's really cold, cockroaches like to be indoors as well, and in that heat and around that heat and humidity. So that's how we came to cohabitate with cockroaches there. Cockroaches are very closely related to termites. Again, if you get into the scientific literature, there was a paper written back in maybe the late 1990s or early 2000s, and it was called Death of an Order. So again, we're talking about taxonomy of cockroaches. And so some scientists did some genome work, and they lumped cockroaches into, or termites, or cockroaches into an order with termites. And so it was kind of caused a lot of stink in the scientific world, if you will. But you know, you can do genetics and find out all these weird answers to questions that you didn't think were important, but maybe they really are, so that we can better understand these animals, being insects and cockroaches. So another thing about cockroaches is they can carry disease-causing bacteria. So sometimes they're considered a public health pest, and it's not just because of the allergens they can cause when populations get in large numbers, but it's because they can mechanically pick up, different pathogens and move them about an environment. And then that last bullet point down there, a German cockroach migration from a restaurant covered a street with cockroaches, and it lasted for 3 hours. So that was a story that came out of New York City many, many years ago, maybe in the 60s or 70s, where they bulldozed a building, and literally German cockroaches moved across the street and into the building next door. I think there's some pictures I found, of that migration from the 60s and 70s. But if you get a chance, you can Google that, and it's quite the picture. So, there's lots of species of cockroaches around the world. There's 70 species in North America, and about 25 of those are considered exotic or invasive. And some examples of that would be the Turkestan cockroach, the desert cockroach, the Yamamoto cockroach. And of these, species, invasive species that have moved into the United States, there's only 3 or 4 or 5, 6, maybe, that have achieved pest status. So keep that in mind that there's a whole lot of other cockroaches out there that are not pests. So why are cockroaches important to us? They infest everything that we like and live in. And so we talk about how they cohabitate with humans. So hotels, restaurants, apartments, cruise ship, railroad cars, warehouses. I was on a flight cross country the other day, not the other day, but a few years ago, and there was a German cockroach on the airplane, and I was going from LA to New York. So they'll hitch rides on airplanes and ships and transportation. That's how they move about the environment as well. And then we talk about rodents lots of time, especially rats, and how they'll leave sebum or grease marks on their primary runways. Cockroaches can do kind of the same thing if there's a huge population that goes untreated for a long time. They contaminate things like we talked about by moving about parasites and bacteria and fungi and other things in the environment. There's even some documentation of cockroaches causing fires where they've gotten into computers and gotten into the electrical wires and they'll chew them and they chew off that outer coating of that wire and get down to the raw, copper wire. And sometimes that can cause fires. Some of the cockroaches have a really high reproductive rate and a really fast reproductive rate. So we'll look at that by species here in just a little bit. And cockroaches have really been portrayed as being able to out survive humans, if you will. But when you get down to the science, cockroaches are susceptible to radiation, drowning, and starvation, just like we are as humans. So the next few slides I kind of wanted to go through. This is from PCT magazine and talks about different cockroaches and cockroach species and treatment techniques. And so it's just kind of a way to maybe you can look at what you're doing. And if you're successful at what you're doing, don't change what you're doing. But if you're not, maybe you can glean some of the information from this. So this first graph, if you will, over on the left, which one cockroach species represents the largest percentage of your service calls? No surprise, it's German cockroaches followed by American cockroaches. And that's why most of the cockroach talks that you go to probably focus on those two species. And then in the past 5 years, have cockroach control services become more or less significant part of your business? So are you going on more calls? Is it generating more money? And most people are saying it's that cockroaches are generating more money and they're more significant. Now, with that said, when we talk about just general groups of pests, ants are the number one group. It used to be cockroaches, but ants are the number one pest group as far as urban pest management in the United States. Cockroaches are second place, if you will. So this slide right here, how do you expect that percentage of revenue generated by cockroach services to look? What do you expect it to do? Increase, remain the same, or decrease? So all across the United States, 51% of PMPs say we think it's going to increase. And if you go to the South over there, 53% of people in the South said it was going to increase. So if you look at the number of people that said it's going to decrease, it's not a whole lot. So cockroach revenue is either flat or increasing throughout the different regions of the United States. Is cockroach resistance a concern in your market area? 63% of people said yes, 37% of people said no. That's why it's important to think about rotation of especially cockroach gel baits and being good stewards of the industry so we can prolong some of these active ingredients that we have for a long time. And then the average callback or reservice rate for German cockroaches. This is a slide where you can kind of look at what at what your callback rate is for German cockroach. So nationwide, it's 6.4%, in the South, 5.7%. And you can kind of look at the other regions there and gauge how you compare to the other regions or how you compare in our region. So when people are asked, what control measures do you utilize to control cockroaches? 45% of people said their primary go-to is gel baits, followed by residual liquid insecticides or dilutable insecticides, which would be 28%. And then there's kind of a myriad of other things that you can see there: IGRs, granular baits, down to sanitation and vacuuming. But when you look at IPM, all of those things are very important. So then looking at rotation, being good stewards of the industry, is it your service location's practice to rotate products with different modes of action? And so we'll talk about that later when we talk about Iraq. But 93% of people say yes, we like to rotate and we do rotate. So it's important to think about that when you talk about your control measures. Who's using glue boards or sticky traps? 49% of people said that's very important, followed by somewhat important being 34%. Glue boards can be very important, especially to help you pinpoint maybe some smaller populations. Maybe you don't have a full-blown population in a house or a commercial establishment, but you can use those glue boards and put enough out in different locations, and you can really document where the cockroach activity is at, and that can help you make very precise um, applications. So this is from PCT Magazine from 2023, and these are just 10 key facts to remember when we're talking about the German cockroach market or German cockroach control. They do have a very high reproduction rate. We'll look at that a little bit more in just a second. They do like heat and humidity, so that can give you an idea of where you need to do your inspections. They're very cryptic in their behavior. They like to hide out. So we've all been in a structure where we go in and maybe there's not anyone there. There hasn't been anyone in that structure for a few hours, or maybe you're there doing a nighttime service at a restaurant. You come in and turn on the lights and the cockroaches scatter. So that's part of that cryptic behavior. They are very aggregate. They like to hang out together. And so they communicate with chemically with pheromones and pheromones, which tells other cockroaches, hey, this is where we're hanging out. You need to come hang out with us. Some cockroaches protect their egg cases, especially German cockroaches. And with that said, most um, egg cases and eggs are not very susceptible to insecticides. So the individual eggs within an cockroach egg case, that outer layer is made up of a substance called chorion, and it's really hard to penetrate that with an insecticide. And then, cockroaches can develop resistance, and they can even develop aversion to certain bait matrices. So it's important to understand these things so that you can be a good steward of the industry. Other things to kind of think about when you think about commercial accounts. So not just restaurants, but think about warehouses or even multifamily housing. German cockroaches, they will carry the egg case till just before hatch, and that's kind of unique to German cockroaches. Other cockroaches will release that ooze ether, that egg case, much faster or longer, or don't hold on to it as long. Their life cycle is very fast. It's shorter than most of the other urban cockroaches. They like cracks and crevices. They like to travel only as far as they need to for their requisites for life. So food, water, and harborage. Think about why the cockroaches are here in this account, where their food is at, what they're harboring, and that can also help you to perform a better inspection and help you to make better precision applications. And then we always talk about how cockroaches like to be in, high heat and high humidity. But if it's a huge population, say within a single family dwelling, those cockroaches will move out into the other rooms, like bedrooms or, a study or something of that nature where there's maybe not water pipes and high humidity. They really like the electrical junction boxes. There's heat in there, and then they like the inaccessible wall voids. And so if there's a way for them to get in into a wall void, then they're gonna do that. And you need to be able to do an inspection appropriately so that you can get in there and make those good applications. When you think about commercial accounts, you got to think about deliveries, right? The deliveries should be inspected. So talk to the folks that work at that commercial account. Ask them when they get their bulk deliveries, and it may be a good idea to show up on a bulk delivery day if you suspect that the cockroaches are coming in with deliveries, and do a little bit of inspection on those boxes as they're coming in. And then employee locker rooms are a highly sensitive area. So I would suggest not going into employee locker rooms by yourself. Always have someone that works at that facility with you, and they can give you access and be there with you while you're doing inspection or even treatment in those areas. So there's a whole myriad of different pest cockroaches, German, American, and there's a whole list down here all the way down to Turkestan. Brown bandits we deal with, occasionally Asian cockroaches, which can be confused with German cockroaches. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Oriental cockroaches. So there's a whole bunch of different cockroaches. Most of these are paradomestic, with the German cockroach not being paradomestic. But Just generally looking at the cockroach life cycle, it's this simple, right? You have an adult female that mates with an adult male. In some time frame, she produces an egg case. Then the eggs within that egg case hatch out, and they go through several nymphal stages. And then those nymphs, late instar nymphs, become adults, and the life cycle just keeps going. So biology of cockroaches, they're hemimetabolists, meaning that they just go from egg, nymph, and adult, which we just showed in that life cycle. But look at some of the species here in the time from egg to adult. So Botella germanica is a German cockroach. It can be as little as 90 days. Look at the American cockroach down there, the last one listed. That can be as long as 600 days. And so this is all dependent on temperature, humidity, and the resources that are available to these cockroaches. So if you have high humidity, high temperature, and lots of nutritional resources for these cockroaches, then that life cycle can be sped up. If it's kind of cold, cool, there's not a lot of humidity, there's not a lot of resources around for nutritional resources for the cockroach, then this life cycle can be slowed down. So these are just kind of the mean numbers from egg to adult for some of these species. So cockroaches, they can secrete oily liquid and excrement, and it's kind of offensive and kind of be a sickening odor. Those of us that have been doing urban pest management for a long time, we can open the door to a restaurant and smell and tell you whether or not there's cockroaches in that restaurant. Some of us can smell rats and mice too, just by opening the door to a commercial account or even a room within an account. And we can tell you there's a lot of cockroaches in here, or there's a lot of rats and mice in here. Cockroaches can cause asthma and allergies, especially German cockroaches in multifamily housing when they get into large numbers. They can move, different pathogens and vector different bacteria and fungi throughout the environment. And then there's this association, this bad stigma of living in filth. And that's not always the case. I've been in five-star hotels that have a German cockroach problem, and everything is super clean. And so, how do those cockroaches get in there? It's kind of not irrelevant at that point, but the main goal is to get rid of them, right? And then they cause mechanical damage, like we said, how they can get into computers or even the wiring in the walls. And then just aesthetically, it's offensive. Maybe not so offensive to me if I'm sitting in a restaurant and I see a cockroach, but someone that's not in our industry and doesn't understand their biology and how well they can move about the environment, they can be super offended if they see a cockroach in a restaurant or other commercial account. So, thinking about how cockroaches can, move pathogens about their environment, and it's just kind of important to understand these simple theories. We're not trying to use scare tactics on anyone to get them to do pest control, but for us as PMPs, if your client, brings this up, it's important for us to know a little bit so that we can talk about these things. But think about American cockroaches. Where do they primarily live? They like sewage areas or underneath homes in a crawl space. And what all is going on down there? Whatever's down there, those cockroaches have the potential to move about up into the living space. And then if they're feeding on these different things, cockroaches are constantly vomiting and pooping in their environment, so they're excreting things out of their body, and then they can just mechanically pick things up on their feet and move these different pathogens throughout their environment and contaminate surfaces, which could lead to outbreaks of certain diseases. There's also that public health significance with cockroaches, kind of a mental issue, if you will. So there's lots of scientific or non-scientific literature, so more anecdotal, on the association of cockroaches and pathogenic organisms. But when you really dig deep into that literature, it's not very scientific. There's not a lot of epidemiology in there, and there hasn't been a lot of scientific trials to maybe prove this. But that is changing. And there's been lots of good work done at North Carolina State University with Kobe Shaw. There's been some work done at Tulane University looking at German cockroaches and how they move about the environment and the potential for them to move pathogens around. So there's, some psychological impacts of that cockroaches can have. We talk about that sometimes with bed bugs, but it does happen with German cockroaches too, where, I've read stories of people putting lighter fluid in the edges of their cabinets and then lighting it to kill the German cockroaches. And It's bizarre behavior, and sometimes it leads to traumatic fires, and they burn down their house or multifamily housing because they thought it was a good idea to put out the lighter fluid and light it to kill the cockroaches. When they get in those high populations, they do give off that odor. There's lots of staining of surfaces, which we talked about earlier. Cockroaches can hide in ear canals and become lodged there. They can chew off children's eyelashes. I've seen that when multifamily housing, when I've gone into units and even single family dwellings where none of the children in the household have eyelashes, and you go into their rooms and there's German cockroaches, all around the bedding and their toys and and even in their nightstands and where they store their clothes. Cockroaches can chew on your toenails, which is keratin, or your fingernails, and nibble on scabs. And so, there is that potential for them to move a pathogen into your body by chewing on your scab. And then, food residues around the mouths of children that may be sleeping, that maybe get a late night dinner and immediately put to bed. Think about a newborn in a crib, that kind of situation. So there's lots of ways cockroaches can move about the environment and potentially move pathogens about the environment. So just kind of looking at some of these general cockroaches that maybe we deal with on a regular basis. American cockroach is the largest, followed by the Oriental, then the German, then brown banded. That's not all the cockroaches we deal with, but four of the more primary cockroaches that we deal with on a daily basis. So this can help you identify them. If you don't get a good look at it, you see a huge cockroach and it's got wings, it's probably an American cockroach. See a bigger cockroach without wings, maybe an Oriental cockroach. So sometimes we go into accounts and we don't see any adult cockroaches, and all we see are maybe nymphal cockroaches, which they can be hard to identify, but we find their egg capsules, right? Their oothecas. And so this is just kind of helpful to understand. If you can differentiate between the different egg capsules, then you can identify, maybe the cockroach that you're going after that you need to focus on, and that can help you determine what products you need to use, what formulations you need to utilize, and maybe where you need to do your inspection, right? So you can look at the Oriental cockroach is a huge egg case, and this bottom kind of white edging right here is called the keel, and it has teeth in it. And so you can look at the orientation of those teeth and compare it to this American cockroach egg case. And, there's differences there that you can plainly see right here. And then if you look at the German cockroach versus the brown banded cockroach egg capsules, the German cockroach is usually much bigger, more elongate, and the brown banded cockroach egg capsule is kind of more ovoid and rounded, if you will. So there are differences in the egg capsules, and it's important to understand and to be able to maybe identify these different egg capsules, which can help you identify the cockroach that you need to be going after in that count. So the primary two species that I mentioned earlier, the German cockroach, the American cockroach. German cockroaches love to live with humans, and the American cockroaches like to live around humans, but they primarily live outdoors. They will get in indoors. I'm not saying they don't, but most of the time they're living outdoors or in a wall void or something of that nature, which is a little bit different, maybe than German cockroaches that exclusively live indoors. There's a whole bunch of paradomestic cockroaches, the American cockroach, the Asian cockroach, down to the Oriental cockroaches. And so, we look at some of these common breeding sites for cockroach infestations. This is from PCT magazine from a few years ago. The Asian cockroach, which we'll look at here in a little bit later, which looks very similar to the German cockroach. They like to live outdoors in leaf litter. American cockroaches love to live in sewers. And then, the smoky brown cockroach is usually associated with some kind of vegetation outside. So just to give you an idea of some of the more common breeding sites on where you might find some of these cockroaches, if you're dealing with smoky brown cockroaches, then it's a good idea to go out and inspect the vegetation up close to the house, and maybe you can find those key harbor areas. So looking at Asian cockroaches, which we do have in Texas, primarily in the Gulf Coast area, the coastal areas, but they look very similar, the Asian cockroach and the German cockroach, at least the adults. And so Asian cockroach adults fly. German cockroach adults do not fly. Asian cockroaches live primarily outdoors. So if you're seeing them outdoors, it's a dead giveaway. And then German cockroaches live indoors. German cockroach is found throughout the state and throughout the United States, where the Asian cockroach has more of a limited range, and it kind of follows the hot, humid areas along the Gulf Coast of the United States. So from Florida all the way over to Texas and everything in between is where you'll find that Asian cockroach. So looking at it a little bit closer here, you can see these pictures. The top pictures are from the University of Georgia, and those bottom pictures are from the University of Florida. So when you look at the Asian cockroach adult and you compare it to the German cockroach adult right there, the Asian cockroach is usually a little bit lighter in color, and the German cockroach is more copper to a reddish tan, which tends to be a little bit darker. Color is not always the best attribute to utilize when you're identifying cockroaches, but it can be an indicator to help you get to the right answer. But if you look at the nymphs right here, the nymph of the Asian cockroach versus the German cockroach nymph, stark difference, right? You can see that white pattern on the lateral edges of the Asian cockroach nymph, where the German cockroach nymph does not have that. The lateral edges of that German cockroach nymph are dark, right? So very different in colorations in the nymphal stage, which can help you separate these two cockroaches. So looking at the American cockroach, like I said, it's one of the biggest cockroaches that you'll find, and they can be upwards of 2 inches in length. They are the largest of the home or structure infesting species. Reddish brown with that pale edge on the pronotum. You can kind of see that in this bottom picture really good, where it says brown pattern. You can see the edges of that pronotum are much lighter. In their egg cases or their ootheca, there can be up to about 14 eggs, plus or minus a few numbers there. 600 days from egg to adult, like we talked about earlier. The American cockroach female, she'll copulate, she'll produce that egg capsule, and then she deposits it in where what she thinks would be a safe area and a moist area. And then, there's 6 to 9 days between ootheca. So once she lays that egg case out there, she can potentially produce another egg case within about a week or so. And then in her lifetime, she can produce up to 6 to 14 egg cases. So you can kind of do the math there and see that, one American cockroach female that lives in a prime environment, she can have quite a few offspring. Love sewers and basements where it's dark and it's humid. They readily fly. So this is that paradomestic cockroach outdoors, and they like to fly. And they can live up to, a year and a half, the adults, in a great environment. Found, everywhere we like to be, right? Restaurants, supermarkets, commercial buildings, where food is prepared or stored. They can invade, different homes, multifamily, single family dwellings. Love sewer systems. And so, when you get into bigger cities and you get, in downtown areas, you can think about that cockroach being in the sewer during the day, and they can jump out of there and come up and go inside, to a structure fairly quickly. They love cluttered areas where they're, hoarding type situations, and they can easily survive in those types of areas because there's lots of harborage and there's lots of food or resources for them to utilize. When you think about the American cockroach, we kind of touched on this earlier, but in her lifetime, she can produce upwards of 150 offspring. And, after mating, that female can produce about one egg case every 7, to maybe 14 days in a perfect world. And then she'll carry that egg case with her for a short amount of time, and then she'll glue that to a surface area that's hidden. And so it's usually behind large furniture or up underneath big furniture or something of that nature. So this is a photo right here where all those little black dots in that photo are American cockroach egg cases. And so we pulled out this refrigerator that happened to be on wheels, and that's what we found. So once that female glues that egg case in a hidden place, she basically abandons that egg case, and she's hoping that those nymphs or those eggs in that egg case will hatch out, and then those first insort nymphs are kind of left to fend for themselves to find their own food, water, and harborage. But remember, they're communicating with pheromones and pheromones, and so they'll usually find a good harborage place fairly quickly. So when you talk about American cockroach control, you can use your gel baits. There's lots of good gel baits out there that control American cockroaches. There's granular baits. There's also residual granules. Um, and there's residual sprays. We talk about synthetic pyrethroids a lot, but there's other non-repellent type sprays that can be utilized. You know, your inspection dictates your treatment. So where you find activity of American cockroaches, where you suspect there's activity, or where you see there's food, water, and harborage for them. And, lots of times I say, for lack of a better term, interview the people that work in this environment, that work at the establishment, or that live in the environment, live in the home. They can tell you where they see them as well. And that's where you need to focus your treatment, or put most of your volume at. So now we're going to kind of move in on German cockroaches here. Let me check the time. Oh yeah. So, they're upwards of about a half inch or maybe a little bit longer. And they have those two racing stripes, which you can clearly see in all these pictures right here from the University of Nebraska. A female is usually darker in color, a little bit broader and more rounded than the male. And when you think about those egg cases, there can be upwards of 50 eggs in a single egg case. And all nymphs, first instars, are kind of a whitish, creamy color, but they'll get that pigmentation through time as that exoskeleton hardens, and so they'll become darker as they go through the different nymphal stages. Now, the female of the German cockroach, she carries her egg case for a much longer time than the American cockroach. So the female German cockroach will carry that egg case up until about 24 to 48 hours before they're going to hatch. So the survival rate of German cockroaches is probably a little bit higher, because when that female is gravid, she's not going to go out into the environment. She usually stays and utilizes that cryptic behavior to her advantage, and she'll hold on to that egg case for a long period of time, right? German cockroaches do not fly, as we pointed out earlier, love humidity, love dark areas, and they can live upwards of 6 months. So they infest structures worldwide, throughout the world. Homes, apartments. We talked about airplanes, trains, boats, restaurants. They like that high humidity, and that they really like temperatures above 70 degrees Fahrenheit. One of the key things to remember here is that when you're going out on a German cockroach call, approximately 80% of that population, of any given population, maybe plus or minus 10 or 15%, are nymphs, right? And so when you're out there doing your inspection at a German cockroach call, and you're seeing lots of nymphs, and you're seeing lots of first instar nymphs, you're really close to the harborage. So keep digging, keep looking, because first instar nymphs and gravid females don't normally venture out very far from their primary harborage area. So when you start to see those two individuals, keep digging, and you're probably going to find that primary harborage area, because when you can get your gel baits or your other insecticides as close as possible to the primary harborage, that's going to help you with your control. So your efficacy is going to go up, right? So yeah, males and non-gravid females and the late instar nymphs are the active foragers, right? They're the ones that lots of people will see in their daily lives. Folks that work in the establishment, or maybe live in the home, that's what they're primarily going to see: non-gravid females, males, and the larger nymphs. And so think about where the cockroaches are harboring, what they're feeding on, and what's the route they have to take, right? One thing about baits, the baits are consumed by active foragers. We'll talk about baits here in just a little bit, or more about baits. And that, baits can be transmitted from one cockroach to the next cockroach in what we call secondary transfer, or even tertiary transfer. So aggregate in those dark, humid areas. They like to get into areas like wall voids or floors, door frames, floor drains, things of that nature. Sticky traps are your friend. They can help you identify key harborage areas and foraging activity. And even, sometimes you can determine what direction the cockroaches are traveling. So that may give you an idea of either where their food sources are at, or where their harborage may be. So if you have a zone monitor up in a tight area, and all the cockroaches are hitting it from the right, and they're facing from right to left, maybe go this way to see if you can find that key German cockroach harborage area. So kind of looking at the German cockroach life cycle a little bit closer, it's approximately 90 days, but that can be, plus or minus a few days. The adult female copulates with the male, right? And in about 10 days, she'll produce that egg case. And in about 30 days, the individual eggs within that egg case will hatch, and you'll have, some first instar nymphs. They'll go through about 6 nymphal instars through a 60-day period, and they become an adult. And if they're females, then they can become gravid, and you can see that cycle going right there. So that's how quickly a German cockroach population can grow in an account. So they are very gregarious. They like to aggregate. Their fecal material contains an aggregation pheromone, and so as they're moving about that harborage and they're pooping and vomiting, that has a pheromone in it, and other cockroaches can sense that, detect that, and they'll come into that harborage area as well. Cockroaches are not true social insects like termites. There's certain behaviors and certain aspects you have to be a true social insect like termites, and German cockroaches don't have that. So they do not collect food like termites do, and they don't distribute food to each other like true social insects do. We talked about how they're very omnivorous and feed on a wide range of food. They'll eat everything that you and I eat, and they'll eat on, glue and other things that you and I don't eat anymore since elementary school, right? Older nymphs and adults will venture much farther from the harborage area than young nymphs and gravid females. Keep that in mind. So when you talk about an IPM program, monitoring and inspection are very important, right? Inspection dictates your treatment. So inspection tells you where to put most of your volume at. And so, put your product per label where you find those target pests, or where you find conducive conditions, where you find the requisites of life that those cockroaches are utilizing. In commercial accounts, it's important to stay on top of those deliveries and where they're storing those deliveries. Maybe you need to go back even a little bit further and look at the trucking company, or maybe the manufacturing plants or the warehouses where these boxes are being stored before they get to your account. And maybe you could pick up a large account that way, by kind of just backtracking and being a detective. Sanitation is very important. Those sanitation reports are very important. I know we don't get a lot of help from most of our clients, but it's still important to fill out those sanitation reports. And pictures can be very important to communicate what you're seeing. If you're allowed, I'll say it again, if you're allowed to take pictures in an account, then it's an easy, good way to communicate, maybe with management or ownership, and what you're up against in trying to control these German cockroaches. So treatment can be non-pesticidal. It can be adulticides. It can be insect growth regulators. So, when you go through this process, which is essentially the scientific method, look at the process. And then when you come back to do a follow-up, was it successful? Was it not successful? I always like to ask, what's the definition of insanity? It's doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So if what you did the first time didn't work, do that again. Change up what you're doing. Maybe it's changing the formulation you're using. Maybe it's changing the active ingredient you're using. Maybe go further out and inspect further out, from where you did before. Maybe use glue boards to help you figure the problem out, but don't do the same thing again and expect a different result. This is the triangle of life, right? The key requisites of life. So think about where the cockroaches are harboring, what are they feeding on, and where are they getting their water. And if you can reduce one of these key requisites of life, or eliminate one of these requisites of life, that's going to increase the efficacy of your insecticide applications. So we all got to have the tools of the trade, right? I'm old school, and that this shows it because I have clipboard listed right here. But I know lots of folks now are using their phone or an iPad or iPhone to do the same work that I had to handwrite everything out. Flashlights or light sources are very important. I used to carry 3 flashlights with me when I was running a commercial route in Texas. And there were times where I still didn't have a working flashlight. It's very unprofessional, in my opinion, to utilize your phone as a flashlight. So, and it's not a good light. So try to make sure you always have a good working flashlight. So looking at all these tools right here, these are all important, but the most important tool that we have on our truck is our knowledge, right? Unfortunately, homeowners or restaurant owners, whatever it may be, can go out and buy, most of the products that we're utilizing, unfortunately, but they don't have the knowledge that we have. They don't understand what certain words mean on the label, or they don't understand the biology, ecology of German cockroaches. And so they're paying us for our knowledge. And so keep that in mind when you're out there, doing these German cockroach jobs. Lots of tools of the trade right there, flashlights, gloves, this mechanic's mirror over here on the top right. Those are pretty handy, especially if you're in a commercial account and maybe there's a big piece of equipment that's not on wheels and you need to see under it or behind it. You can flash your light onto that mirror and it'll reflect the light off that mirror behind that piece of furniture, and you can kind of see back behind there, see if there's conducive conditions or see if there's actually German cockroaches in there. um, Utilizing these plastic vials on here can be important. Some cockroaches look alike, like we showed earlier with the German cockroach and the Asian cockroach. So maybe you need to collect the cockroaches and put them in a vial, and you can take them back to your office, and you have a cockroach expert there that can identify them, or maybe you just need to get them under a microscope and look at certain things and certain key characters, and you can identify it. But sometimes these little vials can be very helpful, whereas in a Ziploc bag or something of that nature, the specimen you put in that bag usually gets crushed and destroyed. So, use the tools of the trades, right? Use your flashlight, your knee pads to protect your body from when you're crawling around on restaurant floors at night and looking up underneath equipment. Make sure you have the screwdrivers so you can take, the face plates off of whether it's a plug plate, or maybe you're looking at the backside of a piece of equipment and you need to take that face plate off to get up in there to look inside that piece of equipment. Utilize those sticky traps. Use your flashlight to look in cracks and crevices and holes and potential harbor sites. Sometimes you can just see the little antenna of the German cockroaches, twitching out from behind something. And, you get your flashlight back there. Okay, well, it's not just one German cockroach. There's 100 of them back there. Remove those refrigerator bags, the motor, and to be able to look at motor housing and compressor areas, and find areas in that piece of equipment where you can make crack and crevice applications. So top 10 common harborage areas for German cockroaches per PCT magazine. Corrugated cardboard. That's why it's important to look at deliveries. Sinks, there's usually water, high humidity. Food carts can be very important, especially if you're in a situation, say, where you're treating the eateries on a university, and they may be cooking the food at a facility, 2 miles from here, then rolling that food up on a food cart, rolling it into the back of the truck and delivering it all the way across campus. So make sure you understand where the food is being prepared and how it's being delivered, and take a look at these food carts, right? We kind of talked about employee lockers. Ceiling tiles can be very important, especially in drop ceilings. So make sure you at least take a look up there. And, there can be German cockroaches or rats, mice, and other pests that we need to take care of in drop ceilings. And then when you get into these kitchens, look at all the equipment in there and look at all the cracks and crevices on the equipment. Refrigerators, coffee machines, those big Hobart mixers that you find in bakeries, those things are hollow. From that top lid will come off. You can take that off and you can look all the way down in that Hobart mixer. So make sure you're paying attention to these areas. Baits are really fantastic, mostly because you can do it crack and crevice, and cockroaches can feed on that, and then they take that bait back to their harborage areas, right? And so you can get transfer of that bait in 3 different ways: through coprophagy, where a cockroach comes out, say a male comes out, feeds on the bait, gets back to the harborage area, maybe gets sick and it starts to poop a little bit. Then the other cockroaches, the first insert nymphs and maybe grab females, will feed on that fecal material from that male, and they will get a lethal dose of that active ingredient. So that would be coprophagy, right? We have necrophagy or cannibalism. Sometimes cockroaches go out, they feed on the bait, they come back to the harbinger and die. And those first insert nymphs will feed on that dead cockroach that died in the harbinger. So there's another way that they can pick up a lethal dose of the AI. And then a metaphagy, the last one here, is vomit. So they simply just go back to the harbinger after they fed on the bait and they become ill and they start to vomit, and cockroaches will feed on that vomit and they'll pick up a lethal dose of the AI that way. So coprophagy, looking at the fecal material of German cockroach, kind of looks like pepper, as you can see in this picture. We've all been in a restaurant, unfortunately, or a home, and you see the little antenna of a German cockroach sticking out behind the frame of a picture. You take that picture off the wall, and there's a complete outline of that picture in fecal material, right? And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about coprophagy. Necrophagy or cannibalism, we see this sometimes, especially in academia and in research. We put, say, 10 cockroaches in an arena, and we give them a gel bait, and they feed on the gel bait, and they start to die. And then you come back and check that to see the speed of kill and the percentage of kill. And sometimes you start out with 10 cockroaches, and you only end up with 8. Well, that's because 2 of the cockroaches died really quick, and the other cockroaches in that arena ate 2 of the cockroaches. So, again, that's the necrophagy. And then a metaphagy, we've already talked about this. It's just the vomit of cockroaches that come back to the harbinger or anywhere in the account, and cockroaches can feed on that vomit and get a lethal dose. So looking at cockroach gel bait placement, just kind of puts it into perspective. You can see the little dollop there on the top. That's a 1/4 inch in diameter, and it's approximately 1/2 gram. And then you can see the 1/8 inch wide and 2 inch long line there. So, this is what your bait placements should look like. So next time you have a full tube of bait, a 30-gram tube of bait, and you're putting out 1/2 gram bait placements, see if you get 60 bait placements out of that tube. If you get only 30, then your bait placements are too big. If you're getting 60 100 bait placements out of that tube, then your bait placements are too small. So just make sure your bait placements are approximately the right size. That does lots of things. It helps the palatability of that bait, and cockroaches can kind of line up on it too and feed on it. So make sure you're getting the appropriate number of bait placements out of a tube, and that'll help you determine lots of things and what you're doing or maybe what you're not doing right. So now we're going to kind of look at the 7 tips for better cockroach baiting, and this is by Dr. Austin Frischman. And we'll kind of look at these real quick, and then we'll kind of talk about them. So to each their zone, cockroaches live in zones, and if they have food, water, and harborage in the top area of a cabinet that's separated by shelves, but there's food, water, and harborage in each one of those zones, that cockroach in their entire lifetime may never move down to the middle shelf. So it's important, if you come into an infestation, you need to get bait, if you will, in each of those zones. Number 2 here is kind of, we've talked about it already, but it's pretty simple, but sometimes we forget about these things. So put the bait between where the cockroaches harbor and where they're feeding at. And so that's when they're traveling this area, but you may not know this is the harborage and this is where they're feeding, or maybe vice versa. But there's cracks and crevices in between, so get that bait in between. Sometimes you can do crack and crevice applications like this one here, if you're allowed to do this. I'll say it again, if you're allowed to do this. It may be against your company policy, or maybe against the commercial account policy, but sometimes you can't get far enough back behind a piece of equipment, but you can get some corrugated cardboard and make some applications on that cardboard and place that cardboard back into a crack and crevice where non-targets won't get in contact with it. Make sure you document that and maybe even number it. And so it becomes like a bait station, if you will, and that you can retrieve it after time and see if all that bait it has been fed upon. And if it has, then you've got an issue in that area. So to each their zone, this is what I'm talking about in a cabinet. So this top cabinet area up here, if there's food, water, and harborage in this area, this cockroach, the cockroaches that live in that top cabinet area may never go to this middle area or this bottom area. So it's important to get bait placements in each one of those zones, right? Here's another example of zones. So this is the plumbing coming in up underneath the cabinet. And you see the pipes coming in right here. There's always the hole is a little bit bigger than the pipe itself. And so, you can use whatever formulation you like, maybe a dust or maybe even a liquid or a gel bait, but you need to get it back in that zone right there, as well as, maybe a couple of other zones within that cabinet to make sure you're covering all the zones that cockroaches may harbor. This is a refrigerator. This is the cap on top of that hinge that protects that. You can pop those off and get bait in there. That's crack and crevice. And even though the refrigerator or freezer is cold, I've peeled back the rubber seal on these things, and it's just lined with German cockroaches before. So make sure you don't miss something as obvious as that. Built-in dishwashers. This happens to be a residential dishwasher, but there's a gap all the way around this dishwasher, right? Make sure you're getting the appropriate formulation here. Some dishwashers have fans on them, so if you put a dust back there or a powder bait, then that fan comes on, it'll blow that powder bait or dust out into the areas where we don't want it. So make sure you're utilizing the appropriate formulations based on the type of equipment and you're working around. When you come into a situation like this, don't get overwhelmed. Just go through it one piece of equipment at a time. Start over here by this big oven right here, then move to the stove top, move to the grill top, this grill top, and then to the fryer, and treat each one of them as a major zone, and then look at the different zones within each one of these pieces of equipment, and you can cover this area fairly quickly. Again, inspection dictates your treatment. So put your insecticides where you have activity, where you have the potential for activity. So moving back to Dr. Frischman, 7 tips for better cockroach baiting. You can look at vacuuming is very important. Vacuuming is not a standalone treatment, but you can get rid of a lot of cockroaches really quick with vacuuming. And so make sure if you're using vacuums, that you're using the appropriate vacuum that has the HEPA rated filter and to prevent blowback of allergens into the atmosphere. And then what you can do with that vacuum bag is, say you're treating a commercial count, you go out and you suck up 1 million German cockroaches, and you treat this restaurant, but you don't treat this restaurant. Take that vacuum bag to the restaurant next door and dump all those cockroaches, and then you can pick up that account the next day, right? Don't do that. Dispose those cockroaches in the appropriate manner, right? So there's lots of different vacuums out there. This just happens to be the one of the picture that I grabbed off the internet. But vacuums can help you get rid of a lot of cockroaches really quickly. Use your sticky traps to determine where you need to put your bait. Sometimes you can use a wire and put some bait on the end of that clothes hanger and get it back into cracks and crevices, especially behind equipment you can't see. So make sure you're utilizing all your tools in your mind to be successful. And we're at 8:58. I think we'll stop right there. And if there's any questions, if we have any time, I'd be happy to take them.
There is one question in the question box. It says, does an IGR disrupt the German cockroach's ability to distinguish night from day?
That's a good question. I don't think I do not know that, but I can find out and fairly quickly. I would think not, because German cockroaches live indoors primarily, and they already don't like light, as we know. And so my scientific brain is saying no, that would not play a role in them being able to determine the day cycle, 24-hour day cycle from nighttime to daytime.
Okay. Does anybody else have any other questions?
That was super interesting. In my experience, being good at treating cockroaches really is failing horribly and then learning what you did wrong.
Absolutely. Great point.
And the next time where you didn't look, we took over a medical facility with Oriental roach problems, and several quality companies had been out there. And, while we were looking, we found a penetration from the ceiling that had spray foam around a pipe that had been deleted. And Oriental roaches were nesting in the spray foam between the roof and that area where they were winding up. And, we treated that as a simple fix, but you had to find it, and it was just missed by everybody. And it was easy enough to miss. And so, but, with Oriental roaches, you don't always look up. And so, um, anyway, we found that and we're able to solve a problem that had been a major problem for that facility. Um, just from dogged determination, really. And so, roaches can be an extreme challenge, as we all know, but finding the source of the roaches can be a challenge sometimes.
Absolutely.
I don't have any other questions coming in.